Welcome to Garden Wise Adventures. My name is Malie. I live in Utah, Zone 6/7, and today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about gardening and how to make it a little more accessible and easier to do. I've started to notice that since the height in COVID, when everybody was really excited about being outside and starting to learn to garden, that the interest is starting to wane a little bit. And I figured there are several different reasons. Number one, people are back to work in the offices and there's a little less time. Maybe there's a little bit less money. And maybe you've just burned yourself out from gardening. So I wanted to create several videos this year. Number one, talking about the benefits of gardening, and I'll link above the last video that I did that talked about the physical benefits of gardening. Then I wanted to talk about what you can do to make gardening more accessible and easier and a lot more fun, no matter what your circumstances. So today's video, I wanted to talk about planning. This is the second week of January, and this is the time I always go around and look at my gardens, see what's in there, and start the planning process. And I wanted to take you through what I do to plan out my garden for the year and why it's important and how it can make it easier for you to want to continue gardening through the rest of the year. So the first thing I do when planning my garden is walk around, look at my garden beds, and start thinking about the previous year. I look at which beds are being used already, because I do grow vegetables over the winter. So there are some beds that are going to not be ready for early spring crops because they're already growing winter crops. There's beds that are empty. There's beds that have things like my perennial Jerusalem artichokes. And I just take note of which beds are open and think about what I grew in them last year and what worked and what I loved and what didn't work. Now the planning process does not always start late winter for me. Like I said, this is the second week in January. A lot of times my planning process starts in the fall because I absolutely love to grow vegetables over the winter. So I have several beds that are full of plants already. For example, this one has shallots in it that will be coming up in the spring. This one has garlic. And I just finished harvesting my fall cabbages out of this bed. This bed has carrots that are frozen in the ground right now that I will harvest in the spring once the ground thaws. Then we have an empty bed right here. This bed is also empty. I harvested cabbages out of this one several weeks ago. And in the front of this bed we have Chinese mountain yams. So I do know that those will be growing up in here, so I can't use the front of this bed, but the rest of this bed is empty. And then last of all, I look at the materials that I have that I'm going to be using when I'm prepping my beds for planting. Now I prepped a lot of my beds in the fall when I removed the compost out of these bins. I removed all the compost and rebuilt these bins for next year's compost. And then I have a big pile of compost to use in the spring here. I have straw for mulch, and I have half a bag of peat moss for the beds that are going to need to be refilled in the spring. So the next thing I think about when planning my garden is what is going to be the reality of this year. Now this year is going to be a little bit different than last year. Last year I was only doing YouTube videos and landscape design, so I had a lot of control over my schedule, so I was able to spend a lot of time in the garden. This year I've actually gone back to doing accounting. I'm working at a nursery and I'm working full-time at the nursery and sometimes really long hours. So my priorities are going to need to change a little bit when it comes to gardening. I need to be realistic, and that is one thing that I think we need to give ourselves permission to do, is be realistic about what we can do and what we can't do, and give ourselves grace for that. Be okay with the fact that maybe you're not able to do as much one year as you were able to do in previous years. But you need to be honest with yourself, otherwise you're setting yourself up for disappointment. So I need to look at my gardens and I need to be honest with myself what I'm going to be able to grow and what I can't grow. Now, one thing that I have done for the past 5 years is I've been able to grow almost all the fruits and vegetables that I eat. I grow enough that I preserve it and I eat what I preserved over the winter. I have food that I've grown indoors and I have my outdoor gardens that I do winter gardening in. But I need to really think about it this year and decide how much time I'm going to actually have to garden, how much energy I'm going to have to garden, and see if the priority of growing most of the food that I eat is actually realistic this year. So I'm going to take you through the process, and we're going to walk through bed by bed. I'm going to think about what I grew last year and think about what is going to be the most important for me to grow this year. I'm going to think about the time it's going to take to preserve it. I'm going to think about the time it's going to take to grow it, the time it's going to take to maintain it, and try and be honest with myself. So let's start over in the side garden and talk about what I feel like I should grow there. Now, if you're relatively new to gardening and you have not grown that much on your own, the first thing you need to think about is, what do you like to eat? Don't start out gardening by growing all the fun and exotic things, because what if you don't like them? If you don't like eating them and they don't bring you pleasure, you're not going to want to continue gardening. Grow the things that bring you joy and that you love. Now, some of the things that bring me the most joy are the things that I grow on this side of my yard, usually, and that is tomatoes. So I produce enough tomatoes usually that I can get through the entire year with tomatoes. This last year was a little more difficult because I started my tomatoes too late, I think, and, well, because of the cold. Yeah, actually I did start them late because it was too cold in the spring, and then we jumped to too hot, and my tomato protection was seriously lacking. But I still was able to produce almost enough for the full year. Plus I had some left over from previous years. Plus I also went out and bought some canned stuff, so I do have enough tomato products for a full year. Now next year, I need to think about how early I want to start my tomatoes. One thing that I can do to start tomatoes earlier is to put them under cover. There's something called wall of water. It's a plastic ring that has cells that you can fill with water that keep tomatoes warm during the early spring times when you might get some frost or some cold weather. I like to put them under the plastic covers that I grow my winter crops under. So I did think about that last fall, and I was really careful to plant plants that I'm going to be able to remove early spring when I want to put the tomatoes in. Now I think I will probably want to plant the tomatoes in here maybe the beginning of May. We're going to have to watch the weather. If it's going to be well below freezing for most of May, then we're going to have to wait until it warms up a little bit. But if it stays in the upper 30s, then I can start my tomatoes in beds that are covered like this. So tomatoes is number one, along with the basil that I like to plant with it. So we will plant tomatoes. I usually need around 21 tomato plants. And when it comes time, we're going to show you how I maintain my tomato plants so that it's less stressful, I get more in a smaller area, and I don't have to do as much work. Now, another thing we're going to talk about a little bit later, and I actually also have some landscape design videos that I'll link down below that talk about how to plan according to the sun exposure, how to plan your gardens according to the temperatures that you're going to get. And this area right here is the bottom of my hill. I live on a slope. Right up there is the Wasatch Mountains, part of the Rocky Mountain Range. And we get cold air that settles down in this area. So this area is not as good for starting tomatoes early. The beds that I showed you first on the side of my house are on the south side, and they warm up really quickly in the spring. These do not warm up, especially this bed right here. This bed right here gets quite a bit of shade, and it stays quite cold. So this is an excellent area for brassicas and lettuces. So almost every single year, matter of fact, you can see the remnants of the Swiss chard that are still chugging along even though we've hit in the teens. This is the area where I like to plant kale and chard and those kind of vegetables. Sometimes even a little bit of spinach. The beds through here have been used to grow tomatoes and squash. I grew sweet potatoes in this bed over here, but I'm going to have to think about how to pare back a little bit. Sweet potatoes are fun to grow. I haven't had a huge amount of success growing them, but I've been able to eat the sweet potatoes that I have grown and found out that my body does not like them. So sweet potatoes are going to be out of the garden for this year. One thing that I do eat a lot of over the winter is spaghetti squash and winter squash, especially the center cut squash. You find center cut squash through row 7 seeds, and it is an excellent, excellent squash. I absolutely love it. I use it to make soups. I actually eat it. I eat it baked, and I've used it in baking. So squash, winter squash and spaghetti squash is very important to me. I also love growing summer squash. These areas in here will be an area where I continue to grow squash. Other things that I can grow in here, because I have brand new trellises, these trellises were new last year. I can use the vertical element and grow peas and beans in this area. I grew beans on this trellis right here last year and they did beautifully. So peas, beans, squash, and then I also grew cantaloupe last year in the center area. Now the cantaloupe that I grew was a very special cantaloupe called topaz melon. It's very rare and it has significance to our family. And I may try growing topaz melons again, but they were difficult to get to fruit. So I'm going to need to think very carefully about whether or not I want to grow them and if I want to take a whole bed of topaz melons and put the time into that and see if they end up being a priority this year also. Now very shortly here I am going to be starting seeds for my early spring garden. And in the early spring I grow cabbages and kohlrabi, spinach, and cauliflower. Now I like to start those beds early enough that they benefit from cover. So I have an empty bed here already. This was planned last fall, so I knew I would have an empty bed here. And so this can be open and ready and also covered for my early spring crops. The carrots are ready to harvest as soon as the ground is thawed, so there will be a second covered bed where I can plant my early spring crops. We will leave this bed open, or maybe we'll plant something that is harvested relatively quickly so that I can have a bed to put more tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers in. This is another bed that I'll be using for my early spring crops. And I love to put peas in this bed, so I think this bed will be reserved for the early spring peas. So that is basically the first step I take when planning my garden, so things can run smoothly and be a lot less stressful through the rest of the year. I go through and think about my priorities, look at my beds, kind of take stock of what I grew last year, and think about what I want to grow this year. Now the next video is going to cover how I plan out those beds on paper and plan the succession planting for those. But if you don't want to wait for that video, I have one that I did last year and I also did it the year before, so you can watch those videos if you prefer. Now I would love to hear what you do to plan out your gardens for the year to make it easier for you to grow. And if you have helpful tips for others who may be getting frustrated about gardening, please comment down below on your tips for gardening. So hopefully this video has been helpful for you. If it has been helpful, I hope you like, subscribe, share it with your friends, and go have a wonderful gardening.